A medieval cathedral window holds more than colored light. It holds a forbidden recipe. For centuries, the methods to create this glowing art were locked away, guarded by guilds, and obscured by time. This is a search for those lost secrets. By the end, you will know exactly how artisans turned sand and fire into the brilliant colors of a Gothic masterpiece. We will uncover how a mysterious red glass was made with copper and urine, and why perfectly clear windows were more valuable than gold. What do you think was the most closely guarded ingredient in their magical craft? Every masterpiece begins with humble ingredients, but for the medieval glassmaker, these were not just materials, they were mysteries. The very foundation of their craft was a secret recipe, a batch mixed in what we might call an alchemist's kitchen. At its heart was silica, the glass-forming skeleton. This did not come from a pristine bag of white sand. It was often scooped from riverbanks, a coarse, gritty material filled with iron and other impurities. Some workshops, seeking greater purity, might use crushed quartz or even finely ground pebbles. This raw, earthy beginning was far from the clear vision of a finished window. To transform this stubborn sand into a flowing liquid, the artisans needed a magical helper called a flux. This substance dramatically lowered the impossible melting temperature of pure silica. The choice of flux was a profound secret that defined regional styles. In the great northern forests of Europe, glassmakers burned vast quantities of beech or oak wood, leaching the ashes to create potash. This potassium-rich flux produced a glass that was workable, but often had a faint green or brown tint. Along the Mediterranean coast, a different tradition flourished. They used soda ash, derived from burning specific salt-loving plants like saltwort or barilla. This sodium-based flux could yield a clearer, more brilliant glass, but the plants were a closely guarded resource. The flux was the true alchemical key, turning impossible fire into manageable flame. Yet sand and flux alone made a glass that was tragically fragile, soluble even, vulnerable to dissolving in moisture over time. The final stabilizing ingredient was just as crucial, though often an accidental guest. This was lime or calcium oxide. It rarely came from a deliberate addition. Instead, it was an impurity within the sand itself, or more often, from the ashes used for the flux. The right amount of lime made the glass chemically stable and durable for centuries. Too little and the window would decay, too much and it would become brittle and unworkable. The perfect balance was a hard-won secret, learned through generations of trial and error, passed down not in books, but in practice. These three elements, silica, flux, and stabilizer, were mixed in precise, proprietary ratios to create the batch. This dry mixture was the master formula, as valuable as any guild charter. A master would guard his batch recipe with his life, knowing it affected everything, the working properties, the final strength, and most mysteriously of all, the color. For within those common ingredients lay hidden sparks of magic. Iron impurities from the river sand could tint the glass green or brown. Manganese, sometimes present in the ash, could act as a decolorizer, counteracting the green to make a clearer glass. The batch was a sleeping potential, and the fire of the furnace would awaken its true nature. That sleeping potential of the batch needed a beast to awaken it. The medieval glass furnace was not just a tool. It was the heart of the entire operation, a roaring architectural marvel built to tame an element. These structures were often massive, partially dug into a hillside for insulation and stability, constructed from fire-resistant stone or brick. They were not a single oven but a complex system of chambers, each with a sacred purpose, The largest and most important was the main melting furnace, sometimes called the Grand Feu, the Great Fire. This is where the magic truly began. Workers would carefully load the batch mixture into giant clay pots, known as crucibles, which were then placed into the fiery maw of this central chamber. Temperatures there needed to reach a staggering 1,400 degrees Celsius or more, a heat that could liquefy stone. Achieving and maintaining that inferno was a monumental task. It consumed fuel at a terrifying rate. Historical records from some workshops note that a single furnace could devour the wood of an entire mature oak tree in just one day. To feed this endless hunger, teams of stokers worked in shifts around the clock, heaving bundles of wood into the fire mouths, ensuring the flame never wavered. The glasshouse was a hellish, vital hub, filled with relentless heat, smoke, and the thunderous roar of the fire. But the Grand Feu was only one part of the story. Adjacent to it was the annealing oven, a lower temperature chamber. When a master gathered a molten gather of glass on his blowpipe or shaping rod, the material was under immense thermal stress. If it cooled too quickly, it would crystallize and shatter into pieces. So the freshly shaped piece would be transferred to this gentler oven, where it would cool down slowly over many hours, sometimes even days, relieving those internal stresses and becoming stable and strong. Then there was the glory hole, a smaller reheating furnace. As an artisan worked a cooling piece, perhaps adding a handle or tweaking its shape, the glass would become too stiff to manipulate. He would simply reintroduce it to the glory hole for a few moments, bringing the surface back to a workable temperature without melting the entire form. This dance between the furnaces, from the violent birth in the ground feu to the careful nurturing in the annealing oven, was a precise and dangerous ballet. The furnace itself was a living entity, and the success of an entire season's work depended on its temperament. A sudden drop in temperature could ruin a batch, wasting weeks of labor and a fortune in materials. A crack in a crucible could see a river of molten glass spill into the ashes. The men who tended this beast were not just laborers, they were firekeepers, and their silent, soot-stained vigil was what made the miracle of glass possible. The roaring furnace demanded its first offering. Into its glowing heart, workers would carefully lower the large clay crucibles, each one a handmade vessel of fireclay designed to withstand the inferno. These pots were not simply filled, they were charged, a term that carries the weight of a ritual. The secret batch mixture, that precise blend of sand, ash, and hidden stabilizers, was packed inside. Then the true test of endurance began. For an entire week, the fire was fed and stoked, its temperature climbing slowly, agonizingly, toward the unthinkable. The goal was to exceed 1,100 degrees Celsius, a heat that would make stone weep and iron glow a blinding orange. This was not a quick blast, but a slow, deliberate coaxing, allowing the materials to fuse without boiling over or cracking the precious crucible. Inside each pot, a slow-motion revolution was taking place. The gritty sand began to dissolve, the fluxes worked their magic, and a thick, bubbling syrup began to form. But this early melt was a chaotic, inhomogeneous soup, with streaks of unmixed material and dangerous bubbles that would weaken the final glass. To tame it, the glassmakers used a long, heavy iron rod called a pontil. Reaching into the searing heat, a skilled worker would stir the molten mass with a slow, deliberate motion. This was brutal, exhausting work, performed in a blistering atmosphere, thick with heat and fumes. The stirring was not random. It followed a practiced technique to fold the material in on itself, over and over, until every part of the batch was fully incorporated. The molten glass was known simply as the metal, and knowing when this metal was ready was perhaps the most guarded secret of all. No thermometer existed for this judgment. It was a knowledge written in the body, learned through a decade or more of apprenticeship. A master would peer into the crucible, watching the flow and viscosity of the liquid as the pontal was withdrawn. He might judge the color of the heat, the way bubbles rose and vanished, or the smooth, honey-like consistency as a small gather was tested on an iron rod. It was a moment of pure alchemical intuition. Pull it too soon and the glass would be grainy and weak. Leave it too long and the volatile components might burn off, ruining the batch's chemical balance. When he gave the nod, the metal was perfect, a seething, homogeneous liquid ready to be born into form. The perfect metal was a liquid sun, waiting to be captured. To gather it, the glassblower used his primary tool, the blowpipe, a long, hollow iron tube about 5 feet in length. He would first heat the tip of this pipe in the glory hole, then carefully dip it into the crucible's molten surface. With a slow, steady turn, he would wind a glowing, honey-like gather onto the end, much like twirling a stick in thick syrup. This first gather was everything. Its size and consistency determined the ultimate thickness and potential size of the final piece. A master knew precisely how much to take, judging by the weight and the color of the heat. Once a sufficient gather was collected, he would roll it on a smooth, flat stone slab called a mava. This crucial step shaped the viscous mass into a symmetrical cylinder and began the cooling process just enough for the next, magical act. Then, placing the pipe to his lips, he would blow. With a steady, controlled breath, he inflated the gather into a glowing, pulsating bubble. This was the Roman innovation that revolutionized glassmaking. But medieval artisans perfected it into an art of breathtaking control. The size and shape of this initial bubble set the destiny for whatever object was being made, from a simple drinking vessel to, most importantly for our story, a vast, flat sheet for a window. For that, they relied on a specific technique known as muff or cylinder glass. After blowing a large bubble, the artisan would swing and manipulate the pipe, elongating the bubble into a long, sausage-like cylinder. Using a special tool called a pontal, a solid iron rod, he would attach a hot glass patch to the bottom of the bubble opposite the blowpipe. Once secure, he would crack the glass free from the blowpipe, leaving the cylinder now attached only by the pontal rod. The open ends of the cylinder were then cut with shears while still hot. This created a fragile glass tube. This tube was transferred back to the annealing oven, where it was carefully split lengthwise with a hot iron. Finally placed back into a special flattening oven, the curved cylinder would slowly soften and slump open, transforming under its own weight and gentle persuasion into a remarkably flat, though not perfectly even, sheet of glass. This was the primary canvas for the stained glass artist, a sheet born from breath and fire, holding within its rippled surface the promise of light and color. But that glowing cylinder was not yet a sheet. It was still attached to the blowpipe, a single point of contact holding a world of potential. To release it, the glassmaker entered the most delicate phase of the dance, a transfer of trust from one tool to another. This is where the pontal iron took center stage. This solid iron rod, sometimes called a punty, was the blowpipe's silent partner. The artisan would heat its tip until it glowed, then carefully touch it to the very bottom of the glass cylinder, the end farthest from the blowpipe. With a skilled tap and a twist, a small patch of molten glass fused the pontal to the piece. Now the cylinder was held at both ends, suspended between two poles of iron. This was the moment of truth. With a sharp, precise tap of a cold iron rod against the blowpipe's neck, the glassmaker would crack the original gather free. A faint, crystalline ping signaled success, and the blowpipe was removed, leaving the cylinder now held aloft only by the pontal iron. The open end where the blowpipe had been was now a hot, ragged circle. The artisan would quickly reheat this opening in the glory hole and use large shears to trim it, creating a clean edge. The same process was repeated at the other end, the end now attached to the pontal. This left a hollow glass tube, open at both ends, ready for its final transformation. But before that could happen, the glass had to be shaped and controlled at every step. And for that, the tools were simple, almost primitive, yet wielded with breathtaking skill. After the initial gather from the pot, the glassblower would roll the molten mass on a smooth, flat stone slab called the mava. This was not just rolling out dough, it was an act of definition. The mava's cool surface instantly hardened the outer skin of the gather, creating a smooth, cylindrical shape that trapped the molten core inside. It established symmetry, the essential first step for any controlled form. Then came the wooden blocks. These were not crude chunks of wood, but carefully carved, concave forms, often made from fruitwood like pear or cherry. And they were always soaking in a bucket of water. When the hot glass was pressed into the wet, charred hollow of the block, it would hiss and steam, creating a cushion of vapor that prevented the wood from burning and allowed the glass to be shaped without sticking. The block gave the bubble its initial form, whether it was to become a round flask or the elongated cylinder for window glass. The entire process was a rhythmic, physical ballet. The artisan would constantly rotate the pipe, or the pontal, a steady rolling motion of the wrists that kept the soft glass from sagging unevenly under its own weight. He would move from furnace to mava, to block, to bench, in a fluid sequence practiced 10,000 times. His world was the heat on his face, the weight of the iron in his hands, and the living, cooling material responding to his every move. It was a dance of fire and breath, of stone and water, where the difference between a masterpiece and a pile of shattered dreams was measured in seconds and degrees. The glowing cylinder, once cooled and flattened, was a canvas waiting for its true soul, color. But the vibrant blues, radiant reds, and deep emeralds of a cathedral window were not painted on. They were born within the molten metal itself, a secret alchemy of metallic impurities. The medieval palette was a direct result of chemistry, a mix of accidental traces and intentional, closely guarded additions. The most common colors often came from the very earth that supplied the sand. Iron, a nearly universal impurity, was the workhorse of the color workshop. Depending on the furnace atmosphere, whether oxygen-rich or oxygen-starved, iron could produce a range of subtle greens, blues, or even a pale yellow. A glassmaker might not even add it deliberately, but he learned to read its presence and sometimes use it to his advantage. For a deep, celestial blue, there was no substitute for cobalt. This was an expensive imported luxury, often coming from mines in Central Europe, or even as far as Persia. Adding just a tiny amount of cobalt oxide to the melt, a mere pinch in a large crucible, would produce an intense, saturated blue that could range from a sky hue to a profound, almost black, midnight. It was so powerful that masters would sometimes create a concentrated blue glass, then dilute it into a larger batch of clear glass, stretching their precious pigment further. Copper was the great trickster of the workshop. Under normal oxidizing conditions, it produced a beautiful range of turquoise and green blues, the color of a shallow sea. But under specific, carefully controlled reducing conditions, where oxygen was stripped away, that same copper could produce a stunning, opaque red. This was a difficult and unreliable transformation, requiring masterful control of the furnace atmosphere, and the resulting red was often streaky or varied. For a consistent and radiant purple or amethyst hue, glassmakers turned to manganese. This mineral, sometimes called glassmaker's soap because it could also be used to neutralize the green tint from iron, produced lovely lavender and violet shades when added in larger quantities. But all these colors, as brilliant as they were, paled before the supreme secret of the medieval glassmaker's art, the ruby red. This was not the copper red, but a luminous, transparent scarlet that seemed to hold light within it, like a drop of captured wine or a frozen flame. This ruby glass, sometimes called cranberry glass, was the pinnacle of alchemical achievement. Its ingredient was not just precious, it was almost mythical: gold. Not flecks of the metal, but gold chloride, a soluble compound created by dissolving gold in a mixture of strong acids. A minuscule amount of this solution, added to the glass batch, would produce that legendary red. The process was phenomenally expensive and dangerously unpredictable. The gold had to be in the exact right chemical state, and the glass had to be reheated in a specific way to develop the color. It was a technique so secret that many glassmakers themselves did not fully understand it, passed down as a kind of magical recipe. To hold a piece of this ruby glass was to hold concentrated wealth and mystery, a testament to the fact that the greatest secrets of their craft lived not in grand designs, but in the silent, colorful chemistry of the fire. That brilliant ruby glass, born from gold, was the ultimate luxury. But for the everyday function of a window, another goal was just as elusive: perfect clarity. The holy grail for a medieval glazier was not color, but its absence, a sheet of perfectly clear, colorless glass they called white glass. This was not a simple lack of pigment, it was a battle against chemistry itself. The enemy was iron, a stubborn guest in almost every batch of sand and ash. Even tiny amounts of iron oxide, measured in fractions of a percent, would tint the molten glass a distinct green or brown, like looking through a very pale bottle. For the great windows of a cathedral, this tint was a problem. It would muddy the other colors, filter the sunlight, and cast a sickly pallor over the interior. The quest for clarity was a pursuit of purity on an industrial scale. Some workshops discovered that not all sands were created equal. Certain sources, like the famous sands from the forest of Fontainebleau in France, were naturally lower in iron. Securing a supply of this prized material could make a workshop's reputation and fortune overnight, turning their clear glass into a premium product, more valuable than many colored varieties. But such pure sands were rare. More often, glassmakers had to perform a kind of alchemical correction. They learned to add a counter-agent to the melt, a substance that would neutralize the green tint. The most common solution was manganese dioxide, a black or gray mineral. When added to the batch, the manganese would undergo a complex chemical reaction during the melt. Essentially, it would oxidize the green tinting iron, changing its chemical state from ferrous to ferric, which had a much weaker yellow tint. The manganese itself would turn a faint pink or purple, which, when combined with the weakened yellow from the iron, could theoretically cancel out to produce a neutral, clear glass. It was a brilliant balancing act, a subtractive color theory practiced centuries before it was formally understood. But this decolorizer held a secret flaw, a time bomb hidden within the crystal clarity. Manganese is sensitive to ultraviolet light. Over centuries, especially in windows facing the relentless sun, the manganese could slowly undergo further change. That faint pinkish hue would deepen, turning the once clear glass a beautiful, unintended lavender or amethyst purple. This phenomenon, known today as solarization or sun purpling, is not a defect, but a signature of time. It is a ghost of the medieval glassmakers' struggle for perfection. A chemical memory, slowly revealed by centuries of light. When you see a cathedral window where the clear background glass has turned a soft violet, you are witnessing the long-term effect of their ancient decolorizing secret. A beautiful failure that reminds us their white glass was never truly colorless, only patiently waiting for the sun to reveal its hidden nature. The beautiful colors were now locked in, but the glass itself remained in a state of invisible turmoil. Every piece, from the grandest ruby panel to the simplest clear diamond, was a prisoner of its own creation. The violent heating and rapid shaping had trapped immense stresses within the material, like a coiled spring frozen in crystal. Left to cool in the open air, these forces would tear the glass apart, causing it to crack or even explode into fragments days or weeks later. To prevent this self-destruction, the glass entered its final, most patient phase, annealing. This was not an artistic step, but a scientific one, a secret recipe of time and temperature. The freshly worked piece was carefully transferred to a special low-temperature oven called a layer, often connected to the main furnace to conserve heat. Here, the temperature was held at a precise point, just high enough to keep the glass soft on a molecular level, but not so hot as to distort its shape. This soaking period, which could last for many hours, allowed the internal tensions to gently relax, to even themselves out. Then began the slow, controlled cooling, the true heart of the secret. The temperature was lowered at a painstakingly gradual rate, perhaps only a few degrees per hour. This schedule was not written down. It was a rhythm felt in the bones of the master glassmaker. He knew that cooling the crown of a vessel required a different patience than cooling the thick base. A large, painted window panel demanded even more care than a small bottle. Rushing this process was unthinkable, a guarantee of financial ruin and wasted labor. A batch of glass could survive the inferno of the furnace, only to silently shatter in the quiet dark of the cooling oven if the annealing curve was wrong. This invisible, silent transformation was what turned a fragile artistic expression into a durable object meant to last for centuries. The annealing layer held no glory. It produced no brilliant colors or dramatic shapes. Yet it was here, in this slow, secretive cooling, that the true strength of medieval glass was forged, a hidden discipline that allowed their luminous art to survive the relentless test of time. That slow, patient cooling gave birth to a new kind of artist. The glassmaker's work was done, but the window's journey had only just begun. The flattened sheets, with their subtle ripples and uneven thickness, were delivered to a very different workshop, a place of quiet precision rather than roaring flame. This was the domain of the glazier. His first task was to understand the canvas. Each sheet was unique, a record of its fiery birth. The process of slitting the cylinder and letting it slump open meant the glass was always thicker in the center, where it had rested on the flattening oven's surface, and thinner towards the edges. It held gentle curves, like the surface of a still pond touched by a breeze. These were not defects, but the fingerprints of the hand-blown process. A master glazier would hold a sheet up to the light, reading its landscape of thick and thin, noting the flow of color and the tiny bubbles or streaks, which they called the glass breath. He was not just cutting shapes, he was matching the character of the glass to the demands of the design. That design was laid out before him in full scale on a large wooden table, a drawing known as the cartoon. This was the architectural blueprint for the window, showing every lead line and piece of colored glass. The glazier would place a sheet of glass over the corresponding section of the cartoon. Then, with a simple but ingenious tool, a red-hot iron point, he would score the glass. The sudden, localized heat from the iron created a thermal shock, causing a clean crack to follow the intended line. He did not cut out complex shapes in one go. Instead, he would break the sheet into rough pieces slightly larger than the final shape. Now came the true test of skill and patience, the glazing. Using a special iron tool with a notched, pincer-like end called a glazing iron, he would literally nibble away at the edges of the glass. He would place the notched jaws over the edge and apply pressure, biting off small chips and flakes until a piece fit the cartoon line with astonishing accuracy, often with a gap of less than a millimeter. This was meticulous, painstaking work. The sound of the glazing iron gently crunching the glass edge was the soundtrack of the workshop. Each piece was a small victory of hand over material, a perfect marriage of the glass organic imperfections and the geometric demands of the design. The glazier was a translator, turning the liquid language of the furnace into the solid poetry of lead and light. The glass was now cut to fit the design, but the faces, the folds of robes, the intricate patterns of hair and leaves were still missing. These fine details were not cut from colored glass. They were painted with fire. The medieval glass painter worked with a mysterious, dark paste, a mixture that seemed almost like mud. Its primary ingredient was ground glass itself, finely crushed into a powder. To this, they added metallic oxides, usually iron or copper, which would provide the color. But these dry powders needed a way to stick to the smooth surface of the window pane. For that, they used a binder, a sticky medium like gum arabic, which is sap from the acacia tree, or sometimes vinegar or even wine. The painter would mix these components into a thick, blackish paste on a glass palette. Using a variety of brushes, often made from the tail hairs of squirrels or other small animals, they would apply this paint to the glass. The application was a masterclass in reverse thinking. To create a shadow on a saint's face, the painter would not apply a dark color, but would instead paint around the highlight, leaving that area as clear glass. The dark paint would block light, creating the illusion of depth and shadow, but this painted detail was terrifyingly fragile. A single touch, a drop of water, could wipe it all away. To make it permanent, the glass had to return to the fire. Each painted piece was placed in a small, specialized kiln, separate from the roaring glass furnaces. It was fired at a much lower temperature, just high enough to soften the surface of the window glass ever so slightly. At this critical moment, the particles of the painted-on glass powder would melt and fuse inseparably with the surface of the pane itself. The organic binder would burn away entirely, leaving only the colored metallic oxide permanently bonded into the glass. It was a second birth for the image, transforming temporary paint into a permanent part of the material. Centuries later, a revolutionary new color arrived, not from the front, but from the back. Sometime in the early 1400s, an unknown artisan made a stunning discovery. By painting a solution of silver nitrate, often mixed with yellow ochre clay as a carrier, onto the back of a piece of clear glass and then firing it, something magical happened. The silver ions would migrate into the glass surface during firing, and when cooled, the pane would glow with a radiant yellow, ranging from a pale lemon to a deep, honeyed orange. This was silver stain, and it changed everything. For the first time, artists could add a brilliant, transparent color without needing a separate pot of colored glass. They could paint it on in gradients, create multiple shades on a single piece, or use it to turn a blue glass into a vibrant green. It was a cheaper, more flexible way to achieve luminosity, and it brought a new warmth and sunlight to the windows of the late Gothic period. This secret, painted on in silver and revealed by flame, was the final alchemy, proving that even after the glass cooled, its dialogue with fire was never truly over. Every painted piece of glass was now a separate jewel, brilliant but isolated. To become a window, these fragments needed a skeleton. a framework of dark lines that would both hold them together and define the image. This was the work of the lead came, an H-shaped strip of cast lead. The glazier would select cames of different widths, choosing them not just for fit, but for artistic effect. A broad lead line might outline a major figure, while a slender one would trace the delicate veins of a leaf. On his workbench lay the full-scale cartoon, and beside it he began assembling the puzzle. He would take a length of lead, and using a special knife, cut it to fit the first edge of the first piece of glass. The glass was gently pressed into one channel of the H-shaped profile. Then the next piece of glass was fitted into the adjacent channel, and a new section of lead was cut to cap its other side. Piece by piece, lead by lead, the flat image on the table began to rise into a three-dimensional mosaic of glass and metal. The lead was far more than just a spacer. It was the structural heart of the entire window. Each joint, where four leads typically met at the corner of four glass pieces, was a point of potential weakness. To secure it, the glazier used a soldering iron. He would touch the hot iron to a small lump of tin and lead solder, melting a droplet onto the joint. With a quick, practiced motion, he would smooth the molten metal over the intersection, fusing the separate cames into a single, rigid network. This created a web of strength, transforming hundreds of individual pieces into one cohesive, surprisingly flexible panel. But the work was not yet weatherproof. The channels of the lead cames were deep, and the glass sat within them loosely, leaving gaps where wind could whistle and rain could seep. To seal the masterpiece, the glazier mixed a special cement. This was a thick paste of whiting, which is powdered chalk, and linseed oil. Using a stiff brush, he would work this sticky putty deep into the channels on both sides of the panel, filling every microscopic gap between the lead and the glass. Then, with handfuls of sawdust, he would rub the entire surface vigorously. The sawdust absorbed the excess oil and polished the lead to a soft, matte grey finish, while the cement hardened within, locking each piece permanently in place and making the window airtight and watertight. The lead cames were never an afterthought. Their pattern was integral to the design, a necessary part of the medieval aesthetic. The artists used these dark lines to their advantage, letting them define contours, add graphic emphasis, and create a rhythm that guided the viewer's eye across the luminous story. The lead was the quiet collaborator, the strong, dark whisper that gave the light its shape and allowed it to endure for centuries against the wind and the rain. The sealed lead panel was a masterpiece, yet it was still a fragile giant. Lifting it into the soaring void of a cathedral wall was an act of architectural faith. These were not small, lightweight decorations, but immense assemblies of glass and lead, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. The stone framework waiting to receive them, the tracery, was a delicate lace of carved stone, beautiful but not designed to bear sheer weight or flex in a storm. To solve this, medieval builders performed a hidden act of engineering alchemy, weaving a skeleton of iron into the very bones of the building. This hidden support system was the true secret to the window's survival for centuries. The primary supports were called saddle bars, heavy horizontal iron rods that ran across the width of the window opening, often one bar for every few feet of height. These bars were not an afterthought slapped onto the surface. They were embedded directly into the masonry of the stone mullions, the vertical stone dividers between the window lights. Masons would leave narrow slots or holes in the stone as they built the wall, and the blacksmith would forge each bar to fit precisely into these sockets. Once the stonework was complete and the bar was seated, the slot was often packed with molten lead, locking the iron into the stone with a permanent, unshakable grip. The leaded glass panel itself was then lifted into place against this iron grid. But how do they attach something as brittle as glass to solid iron? They used a deceptively simple solution: copper wires. During the panel's assembly, the glazier would solder short lengths of copper wire, called ties, directly to the lead cames at strategic points along the panel's edges and across its center. Once the panel was positioned in the window opening, resting against the saddle bars, a worker would take these loose copper wires and wrap them tightly around the iron bars. Copper is wonderfully malleable. It could be twisted securely by hand without needing heat or special tools, creating a firm but flexible connection. This flexibility was the genius of the system. Stone buildings breathe. They settle and shift with the seasons and the centuries. A rigid connection between glass and stone would have shattered the windows within a generation. But the copper ties allowed the heavy glass panel to hang from the iron armature with a slight give, able to sway a fraction of an inch without breaking, absorbing the subtle movements of the living building around it. For especially large or tall windows, a second set of vertical iron bars, called tie bars or stanchions, were added. These ran from the top of the window, opening down to a secure anchor point in the floor or a lower wall, bracing the entire assembly against the powerful push of the wind, which could turn a vast surface of glass into a giant sail. From the inside of the cathedral, you rarely see this iron skeleton. The glass appears to float miraculously within the stone, but if you look closely, you might spot the subtle, dark line of a saddle bar silhouetted against the bright sky, or the twist of a green verdigrised copper tie holding centuries of light and story firmly, yet gently, in place. It was this hidden marriage of malleable copper and immutable iron, this silent engineering within the art, that allowed the colors to outlast the empires that built them. While the great cathedrals blazed with color, a quiet revolution in light was taking place in remote valleys. The Cistercian monks, following the strict reforms of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, saw the brilliant narrative windows of other churches as a dangerous distraction. Their rules forbade any figurative art in stained glass, banning the rich blues and ruby reds that depicted saints and biblical tales. For them, the very purpose of a window was to admit pure, unadulterated divine light, not to tell stories with colored pictures. This severe restriction forced their glaziers to master a completely different secret, one that turned limitation into breathtaking innovation. They became the undisputed masters of the griselle window. Griselle, from the French word for grey, did not mean dullness. It described windows made almost entirely from clear or very lightly tinted glass, then painted with intricate designs using only the dark iron-based paint. Without color to rely on, the artists focused on the pure play of light and line. They covered these large panes with astonishingly complex patterns, lattices of interlacing circles, delicate scrollwork of abstract foliage, and geometric borders of stunning mathematical precision. The secret was in the painting technique. To create the design, they painted the background. They would apply the dark paint over the entire surface of the glass, then meticulously scratch away the negative space of the pattern using a stylus, revealing the clear glass beneath. This method, known as esgraffito, allowed for lines of incredible fineness and detail. The result was a luminous, silvery grey tapestry of light. When the sun streamed through a Cistercian griselle window, it did not cast pools of colored light onto the stone floor. Instead, it projected the intricate, shadowy tracery of the design itself, turning the entire monastic interior into a shifting, ethereal pattern. The monks worshipped within a living geometry of light and shadow, a meditation on form and purity. This was their secret, achieving profound beauty and spiritual complexity, not through the alchemy of color, but through the masterful control of clarity and line, proving that sometimes the greatest artistry is born from the strictest rules. Yet for centuries, the actual formulas for these colors and techniques were not found in any cathedral, but hidden in handwritten books. These manuscripts are the Rosetta Stones of the glassmaker's art, our most direct line to their secret world. The most famous is a 12th century work known as On Diverse Arts, written by a monk who called himself Theophilus. This is not a dry textbook, but a passionate, practical guide. Theophilus walks the reader through building a furnace, gathering glass, and even creating specific colors. He instructs how to make a green glass from copper and lead, and describes the process for a beautiful blue using the mineral zafir, which we now know contains cobalt. His writing feels like having a master looking over your shoulder, a rare and precious glimpse into the workshop. But even Theophilus, for all his detail, holds back. His instructions often skip vital steps or assume a foundational knowledge the reader already possesses. He might tell you to mix a certain ash with sand, but not where to find that specific ash, or how to prepare it. He describes the glory hole, but not the exact feeling in the hands when the glass is at the perfect temperature for working. These omissions are not mistakes. They are the boundaries of the written word. They point to a vast ocean of tacit knowledge that could only be passed from master to apprentice through years of shared labor. Later manuscripts, like the 15th century Italian recipe books, are even more cryptic. They are often just lists, concise to the point of mystery. One recipe for a ruby red might simply state, "Take gold and treat it thus, and you will have a beautiful color." The thus is everything. It represents the guarded, hands-on secrets, the exact timing, the color of the flame, the smell of the melt, the weight of the gather. These texts were memory aids for the initiated, not textbooks for the novice. They prove that the guilds did more than control trade. They protected a living, breathing, and ultimately silent tradition. The true recipe was not just in the words on the page, but in the soot-stained hands, the judgment in a glance toward the furnace, and the whispered corrections in a noisy workshop long ago. The silent knowledge of the workshop found its fortress in the guild. These were not mere trade unions, but powerful, almost monastic brotherhoods that governed every aspect of glassmaking, from the selection of raw materials to the final sale of a window. To become a glassmaker was to enter a closed world, bound by oaths and rituals as complex as the chemical recipes they guarded. The hierarchy was rigid and symbolic. At the bottom was the apprentice, a boy often as young as 12 or 14, bound by a legal contract to a master for a term of 7 years or more. His life was one of servitude and gradual absorption. He would not touch a blowpipe for years. Instead, he chopped wood to feed the furnace's endless hunger, mixed batches of sand and ash, cleaned tools, and observed. He learned through osmosis, by being present in the heat and noise, by watching the master's posture, the timing of his breaths, the subtle signs of readiness in the molten metal. This was education by immersion, where the secrets seeped in through the pores over thousands of days. After his term, if his master deemed him worthy, the apprentice would produce a masterpiece, a piece of work proving his skill. Only then could he ascend to the rank of journeyman, from the French journée, meaning a day's work. Now a paid craftsman, he was free to travel, as the name implies, working in different workshops across Europe, to learn regional variations and new techniques. This wandering period was crucial. It prevented knowledge from becoming stagnant and fostered innovation within the closed system. But a journeyman still worked under a master's license and could not open his own shop. To reach the pinnacle, to become a master himself, required another monumental test. He would have to craft an even more ambitious masterpiece under the watchful eyes of the guild's elders, a work of such technical and artistic excellence that it proved he was not just a skilled pair of hands, but a guardian of the tradition's soul. Upon passing, he would swear a solemn oath of secrecy, pay substantial fees, and finally gain the right to own a furnace, hire apprentices, and sell his work under the guild's prestigious seal of approval. This entire structure served one supreme purpose: to protect knowledge as the guild's most vital asset. Their technical recipes were a form of intellectual property more valuable than any single piece of glass. Guild statutes were filled with regulations punishing anyone who revealed the mysteries of the craft. An apprentice who fled before his term was complete could be hunted across borders and forced to return. A journeyman who shared a color recipe with an outsider could be fined, imprisoned, or banished from practicing in any city with a guild charter. The punishments were severe because the threat was existential. If the secret of making ruby glass with gold became common knowledge, its market value would collapse. If the formula for a perfect flux was leaked to a rival town, it could destroy the economic foundation of an entire community. The guilds created a monopoly on mystery. They controlled quality, set prices, and ensured that the river of technical knowledge flowed only through approved channels, from master to apprentice, generation to generation, in the sacred, smoky space of the workshop. This wall of secrecy is precisely why so many of their processes feel like magic to us today. They were designed to be incomprehensible to the uninitiated, turning craft into a kind of secular priesthood where the light passed through glass, and the knowledge passed only through sworn hands. That guild-protected knowledge created distinct regional dialects in the language of glass. While the cathedrals of France and England rose with their brilliant mosaics, two other traditions were perfecting their own secret recipes, each born from the landscape that surrounded them. In the bustling maritime Republic of Venice, glassmakers achieved what many thought impossible: a glass so clear and thin it seemed to be made of frozen air. They called it cristallo, and its creation was a state secret guarded with the severity of a military campaign. The first secret was the silica. Rejecting ordinary river sand, Venetian masters sourced their silica from perfectly pure quartz pebbles, often gathered from specific riverbeds in the alpine region of Ticino. These pebbles were roasted, then quenched in cold water to make them brittle, before being painstakingly ground into a flawless, iron-free powder. The second secret was the flux. Through their vast trade networks with the Levant, the Venetians imported soda ash made from the ashes of saltwater plants, which grew in saline coastal soils of the Middle East. This sodium-rich flux melted at a lower temperature than potash and produced a more fluid, workable glass with exceptional clarity. The combination of pure quartz and Levantine soda ash was revolutionary. It yielded a glass that was not only nearly colorless, but also remarkably malleable when hot, allowing artisans to create the impossibly delicate stems, paper-thin bowls, and intricate lacework that made Venetian glass the envy of the world. The entire industry was isolated for security, moved to the island of Murano in the Venetian lagoon in the late 13th century. This served two purposes. It contained the risk of fire to the city's wooden structures, and more importantly, it imprisoned the knowledge. Masters were forbidden from leaving Murano on pain of death, and the recipes for cristallo were never to leave the island's furnaces. Far to the north, in the deep forests of Germany, France, and Bohemia, an entirely different glass tradition thrived. This was Wohlgelers, or forest glass. Its secret was not purity, but profound practicality and a deep symbiosis with the woods. These workshops were nomadic, temporary operations. Glassmakers would move into a forest, build simple clay and timber huts around a furnace, and stay only as long as the local fuel and raw materials lasted. which might be a single season. Their silica came from whatever sand or crushed quartz they could find locally, often full of impurities. Their flux, however, was a direct gift of the forest itself, potash. They would burn enormous quantities of beechwood, a tree chosen for its high alkaline content. The ashes were collected and leached in water to extract the potassium-rich potash. This potash, combined with the iron in the local sand, gave forest glass its most famous characteristic, a natural and delightful greenish or yellowish-green tint, the color of a sunlit leaf or pale sea glass. This was not a flaw to be corrected, but the signature of its origin. The glass was thicker, more robust, and less refined than Cristallo. It was blown into sturdy utilitarian vessels, like the iconic Kreutztrunk, a cylindrical drinking jar with a pinched, decorative collar, and simple window panes for common homes and churches. Where Venetian glass was about transparent luxury, forest glass was about hearty, functional beauty. Its secret was a recipe written in geography, using the trees that shaded the workshop and the earth that lay beneath it, creating a material that literally embodied the forest from which it came. One tradition reached across seas for purity, the other reached into the soil for practicality, and both held their light in a different kind of hand. But of all the colors born in that fire, one stood apart as the ultimate test of a master's skill. A color so difficult it bordered on alchemy. This was the true copper red, not the opaque, streaky version, but a deep, transparent ruby that glowed like a garnet held to the sun. Its creation was a dance on a knife's edge, a delicate manipulation of the furnace's very breath. The secret lay not in the copper itself, but in the absence of something, oxygen. In normal conditions, copper oxide dissolved in glass produces beautiful blues and greens, but in a special, oxygen-starved environment, called a reducing atmosphere, the chemistry flips. The copper ions change their state, clustering together into tiny nanoparticles that scatter light in a way that lets only the deep red wavelengths pass through. Achieving this reduction was the great mystery. The medieval glassmaker had no scientific gauge for oxygen levels. His tools were observation, tradition, and a bag of strange additives. To strip the oxygen from his melt, he would introduce organic materials rich in carbon. Historical recipes and analysis of ancient glass point to some surprising ingredients. Crushed charcoal was a common choice, tossed into the crucible where it would burn incompletely, greedily consuming the available oxygen. But one of the most intriguing additives mentioned in old texts is urine. It sounds bizarre, even unsavory, to us, but to the alchemical mind it made perfect sense. Urine is rich in urea and other nitrogenous compounds, which decompose under heat and can create a powerfully reducing environment. The craftsman might have used the urine of animals, or even his own, collected and added to the batch. This was not mere superstition. It was applied chemistry born from centuries of careful, if not fully understood, trial and error. The process was fraught with peril. Too little reducing agent, and the glass would remain a muddy green or brown. Too much, and the reduction could go too far, causing the copper to precipitate out as metallic flecks, turning the glass an opaque, dull red or even a blackish sludge. The temperature and timing were everything. The master had to judge the exact moment when the red was perfect, a luminous scarlet suspended in the melt, and then quickly remove the crucible or change the furnace draft to stop the process. It was a secret held in the eyes and the hands, a fleeting red flash in the heart of the flame that, if captured, created a color more valuable than any gem. That luminous ruby, born from copper and fire, was more than just a color. It was a word in a silent, universal language, For the vast majority of medieval people who could not read the Latin Bible, these windows were their sacred text, a radiant Biblia Pauperum, or Bible of the poor. Every hue, every figure, every scene was a deliberate choice, encoding layers of theological meaning into the very fabric of light. The artists and theologians who designed these windows understood that color itself was a powerful symbol. The celestial blue made from precious cobalt was not just beautiful. It was the color of heaven, of divine truth, and the Virgin Mary's mantle. The fiery red of the ruby glass symbolized the blood of Christ, the passion of the martyrs, and the fiery warmth of the Holy Spirit. Emerald green represented life, resurrection, and the fertility of faith, while a pure, clear white stood for purity, innocence, and divine light itself. These colors were used in combination to tell stories and highlight virtues, guiding the viewer's understanding through a visual grammar of light. The figures within the glass were also rich with coded meaning, a visual shorthand that any faithful person could learn to read. This symbolic language is called iconography. For instance, the Lamb of God, often shown with a halo and holding a banner of victory, was an immediate reference to Jesus Christ as the sacrificial offering for humanity's sins. Saints were rarely identified by name tags. Instead, they carried specific attributes, objects that told their story. Saint Peter is almost always shown holding a set of keys, representing the keys to the kingdom of heaven given to him by Christ. Saint Catherine might be pictured with a spiked wheel, the instrument of her martyrdom. Saint Lawrence is shown holding a gridiron, the grill on which he was martyred. A figure pouring water from a jug would be recognized as the Samaritan woman at the well. This system allowed even an illiterate farmer to walk into a cathedral, and by recognizing these symbols, read the lives of the saints and the stories of Scripture painted in light above him. The placement of these windows within the cathedral architecture was itself a profound theological statement. The building was a map of the cosmos, and the windows were its illuminated points. The eastern end of the church, where the altar sits, is oriented toward Jerusalem, the direction of the rising sun. The windows here, particularly the great east window above the altar, were the most sacred. They often depicted the final judgment, the crucifixion, or the resurrection, bathing the holiest space in the light of the world's salvation. The north side of the cathedral, which is perpetually in shadow and associated with cold and darkness, often featured windows from the Old Testament, stories of law, prophecy, and the world before Christ's light. The south side, flooded with warm sunlight throughout the day, was typically reserved for the New Testament, stories of grace, revelation, and the life of Christ. This created a physical journey from darkness into light as a worshipper moved through the space. Windows in the nave, the main body of the church where the congregation stood, often told sequential biblical stories in a comic strip format, perfect for teaching. Windows in the choir, where the clergy performed the liturgy, might feature more complex theological concepts or portraits of prophets and apostles supporting the sacred rituals. Even the quality of the light was part of the message. The brilliant multicolored light streaming through a narrative window was seen as a physical manifestation of the lux nova, the new light of God's grace, transforming the stone interior into a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem. So when a medieval person gazed up at these windows, they were not simply seeing a pretty picture. They were reading a book written in color and shadow, following a story mapped onto the walls of heaven itself, and standing within a theology built from light. The very chemistry that gave medieval glass its strength now makes it a target. These ancient windows are locked in a silent battle with the modern world, a conflict between their timeless formulas and a new atmosphere they were never designed to endure. It is a story of paradoxical durability. The medieval recipe, rich in potassium from wood ash and calcium from lime, created a glass that is surprisingly resistant to one kind of damage: simple weathering. When pure water condenses on its surface, it slowly leaches alkali ions, like potassium and sodium, out of the glass. But in medieval glass, this leaching process tends to form a stable, protective gel layer on the surface that actually slows down further corrosion. It is a kind of self-healing skin that allowed these windows to survive centuries of rain and condensation. Modern soda-lime glass, the kind in your windows at home, behaves differently under the same conditions. Its chemical composition often leads to more destructive pitting and clouding when exposed to water alone over long periods. So in a clean, pre-industrial environment, the medieval glass had a hidden advantage, a built-in resilience born from its rustic ingredients. That resilience, however, is no match for the chemistry of the 20th and 21st centuries. The greatest threat now comes from atmospheric pollution, specifically sulfur dioxide. This gas, released from burning coal and other fossil fuels, dissolves in water to form sulfuric acid. When this acidic moisture settles on the glass surface, it attacks with a ferocity plain water never could. The acid reacts violently with the glass's protective gel layer and the calcium within the glass itself. This chemical reaction produces two new compounds that spell disaster for the window. The first is gypsum, or calcium sulfate. The second is a complex crust of sulfates and carbonates that traps soot and dirt from the air. You can see this damage with your own eyes on the outside of neglected medieval windows. It looks like a rough, opaque, white or grayish crust, sometimes flaking away like stale pastry. This crust, called a sulfation crust, is not just dirt sitting on the surface. It is a cancerous growth from the surface, a permanent transformation of the glass itself into a crumbling, chalky scab. As this crust grows thicker, it completely obscures the painted details and brilliant colors beneath. Even worse, it can expand and contract at a different rate than the healthy glass underneath, causing the original glass pane to crack and splinter from the stress. The lead cames holding the panel together are also attacked, corroded by the same acidic environment into a brittle, powdery state. This means the entire structural integrity of the window is under assault, from both the glass and its metal skeleton. Acid rain does not just stain the story, it systematically dismantles the very pages it is written on. The windows that survived the Reformation, wars, and centuries of weather are now facing an enemy their makers could never have conceived. An atmosphere turned to vinegar, silently eating away at the light of the past. To fight that silent corrosion, a new kind of alchemist enters the cathedral. Armed not with blowpipes and potash, but with X-ray guns and electron microscopes, the modern conservator becomes a detective, using science to reverse engineer the very secrets the guilds died to protect. The primary tool in this forensic investigation is X-ray fluorescence, or XRF. It is a handheld device that looks like a sci-fi ray gun. When pointed at a pane of glass, it bombards the surface with harmless X-rays. This excites the atoms in the material, causing them to emit their own unique fluorescent X-rays. By reading this energy signature, the conservator can instantly determine the exact chemical composition of the glass and its paints without ever touching the surface. This non-destructive magic reveals the hidden recipe book. It can tell the difference between cobalt, blue from German mines, and copper, blue from local sources. It can detect the faint trace of gold in a ruby-red pane, confirming a legendary recipe was real. It can even identify the specific type of wood ash used as a flux, tracing a window panel back to the forest where its sand was melted. This technology strips away centuries of grime and guesswork, laying bare the original choices of the medieval artisan. But the revelations go deeper than chemistry. Conservators also use powerful scanning electron microscopes to peer into the very soul of the glass. By taking a microscopic cross-section of a painted detail, they can see its structure in astonishing detail. This has solved a long-standing mystery about the famous silver stain, that radiant yellow applied to the back of the glass. For years, scholars debated how it worked. The electron microscope showed them. It revealed a breathtakingly thin, distinct layer of silver nanoparticles embedded just beneath the glass surface, a permanent metallic touch due only a few micrometers deep. This proved the silver ions did not just sit on the surface. They migrated into the glass during firing, creating that glowing color from within. The microscope also exposes the layer cake structure of the dark paint used for faces and shadows. It shows how the medieval painter often built up the image in multiple, translucent applications, each fired separately, to achieve a subtlety of shading that the naked eye perceives as soft and continuous. Perhaps the most poignant discoveries are not about creation, but about care. Modern analysis frequently uncovers evidence of medieval and post-medieval repairs, proving these windows were cherished and maintained by generations long before the concept of historic preservation existed. XRF analysis might reveal that a missing piece of blue glass, replaced centuries ago, has a slightly different chemical signature than the original, pointing to a later repair workshop using a similar but distinct batch of cobalt. Under magnification, conservators find evidence of ancient soldering on lead cames, where a broken joint was carefully mended. They discover patches of glass held in place not by original leads, but by thin copper strips called verjets, a common repair technique from the 16th and 17th centuries. Sometimes they find entire panels where the glass has been carefully removed, cut down, and re-leaded into a new configuration to fit a changing architectural opening. These are not mistakes or vandalism. They are signatures of devotion. They tell us that the people who lived under these windows value them enough to fix them, using the best techniques of their own day, creating a physical palimpsest of continuous reverence. Every time a conservator's scanner beeps or a microscope image resolves, it does more than inform a restoration. It starts a conversation across 800 years, allowing the modern world to finally ask the medieval craftsman a direct question, and sometimes to hear a clear answer. The secrets in those old recipe books are not just incomplete, they are sometimes ghostly. Between the lines of practical instruction, medieval texts hint at effects and methods so fleeting they may have vanished entirely, leaving only a whisper of their former brilliance. Consider the challenge of luster. Some manuscripts speak of glass that shimmered with an iridescent, metallic sheen, like oil on water or the wings of a beetle. Modern glassmakers can create luster effects, often by applying metallic salts and firing at low temperatures, but the specific medieval recipes, likely using combinations of silver, copper, and perhaps even bismuth or lead, applied in a precise sequence and fired in a very particular reducing atmosphere, remain elusive. The results described in Poetry and Guild records a glass that changed color depending on the angle of light, glowing with a deep internal fire nuances we struggle to recapture. The old masters may have used organic binders or even fermented solutions that left no chemical trace, their exact preparation lost in the oral tradition of the workshop. Then there is the puzzle of scale. Gothic cathedrals contain some truly massive panels of glass, single figures that stretch several feet in height. The cylinder-blown method produced sheets, but they were limited by human lung power and the sheer weight of molten glass. How did they create such large, relatively uniform pieces? Texts might cryptically mention reinforced blowpipes, special swinging techniques to elongate the bubble, or perhaps even a method of slumping glass over a large, curved mold, a form of early casting. The secret might have been in the teamwork, a coordinated dance between multiple masters handling a single gather. A technique so demanding it died out when the great cathedral building boom ended. But perhaps the most haunting lost secret is one of consistency. Modern artisans, using pure chemicals and digital kilns, can produce stunning glass. Yet they often speak of a certain depth and vitality in medieval color, a luminous living quality that is hard to replicate. The old texts say to add copper and urine for red, but they do not specify the diet of the animal that provided the urine, which would change its chemical composition. They do not record the exact temperature curve of the wood-fired furnace on a humid Tuesday in spring, which would affect the reducing atmosphere. They could not quantify the trace amounts of titanium or antimony that came as impurities in their local sand, which acted as unseen modifiers. The secret was not just in the recipe, but in the entire ecosystem of the workshop, the specific water used to quench tools, the clay of the crucibles that leached minerals into the melt, the constant, variable breath of a charcoal fire. These conditions created a unique chemical fingerprint in each batch, a signature of time and place. When we try to recreate a medieval blue today, we can match the cobalt percentage exactly. But we cannot replicate the 100 other variables that the master intuitively balanced. This is why authentic restoration is so challenging, and why a newly made piece, even if chemically similar, often sits differently in the light. It lacks the silent chorus of accidents, adjustments, and environmental whispers that the original glass absorbed during its creation. Some techniques are not lost because the instructions are gone, but because the world in which they worked is gone. The true secret may have been a profound, unspoken dialogue between the artisan and his materials, a conversation held in the flickering light of a furnace that will never burn again. That ghostly conversation between artisan and material left its signature everywhere. To truly read a medieval window, you must learn to see past the picture and into its physical soul, to recognize the imperfections that are its greatest mark of authenticity. The first clue is often right in the center of a clear pane. Look for a small, thickened lump or a distinct circular pattern, like the rings on a tree stump. This is the bull's eye, the undeniable fingerprint of crown glass, an alternative method to the cylinder technique. Here, the glassblower would create a large, flattened bubble, then attach it to a pontil rod at the very center of the disc. Spinning the rod rapidly, centrifugal force would stretch the molten glass into a large, round sheet. The spot where the pontil was attached, the very heart of the spin, would be left as this distinctive bull's eye, a permanent record of the tool's grip. It was often cut out and used in smaller, less prominent windows, but sometimes a glazier would incorporate it deliberately, letting that swirling center become a halo of light around an angel's head or the radiant sun in a creation scene. Even in cylinder glass, you can see the evidence of breath and motion. Hold a pane at an angle to the light, and you might see gentle, curved striations, like faint fingerprints in the glass. These are the frozen waves of the blowing process, the subtle ridges and valleys formed as the hot cylinder was swung and elongated. They catch the light differently, making the glass appear to move as you walk past it. Then there are the tiny, trapped witnesses to the furnace's fury, the bubbles and inclusions. These are not mistakes, but honest artifacts of the process. Small, spherical bubbles are pockets of air trapped during the initial melt or the stirring of the metal. Larger, elongated bubbles often trace the path of the blowpipe's final breath. You might also see dark specks or stony threads, called cords or stones. These are unmelted grains of sand, bits of refractory material from the clay pot, or crystalline formations that never fully dissolved. To the medieval mind, these were simply part of the material's character, the glass's breath and bone. Most telling of all is the uneven thickness. A machine-made modern pane is flat and uniform. A hand-blown medieval sheet is a landscape. It is always thicker in the center and thinner toward the edges, with a gentle, organic curve. This variation is the secret to its magical, living quality in sunlight. As light passes through these varying densities, it bends and refracts at slightly different angles. This does not create a blur, but a vibrant, shimmering effect, a constant subtle dance of brilliance and shadow that makes the colors seem to breathe. A saint's robe does not sit flatly in red, it pulses with light. This is why photographs of stained glass so often fail to capture their essence. You are seeing the color, but not the living light. The imperfections are the anti-forgery marks of history. In the 19th century, during the Great Gothic Revival, factories produced magnificent stained glass windows for restored cathedrals. They are beautiful, but they are often too perfect. The glass is mechanically rolled, flawlessly even and flat. The colors, while vibrant, can lack depth because the light passes through them uniformly. The leads are sometimes too thin and precise. To the trained eye, it feels different. It looks like a reproduction of a picture, not a translation of light through handmade material. So the next time you stand before an ancient window, do not just look at the image. Look for the bull's eye, trace the curved striations, find the tiny bubble frozen in time. See how the thickness varies, turning the sunlight into liquid motion. These are not flaws to be overlooked. They are the silent, sparkling signatures of the hands that made them, the true and lasting voice of the medieval craftsman. Those ancient imperfections are not locked in the past. The same ripples of light, the same chemistry of color, still flow through the windows of our own time. The medieval craft never died. It simply passed its secrets down a new lineage, finding fresh expression in the hands of artists who looked back to move forward. Perhaps no one embodies this bridge between ages more than Louis Comfort Tiffany. At the end of the 19th century, in an era of industrial mass production, Tiffany became obsessed with recapturing the very qualities we now cherish in medieval glass: its organic variation, its deep, luminous color, its inherent poetry. He rejected the flat, anemic sheets of factory glass. Instead, he sought to revive and reinvent the old ways. His workshops rediscovered the use of metallic oxides for coloring. But he pushed the alchemy further, creating new hues and textures by mixing and layering different colored glasses while still molten. Most famously, he embraced the crown glass method, that medieval technique of spinning a disc to create a bull's eye. Tiffany's artisans used this method to produce what he called Favral glass, sheets with incredible, swirling patterns of color and a brilliant, iridescent surface achieved through metallic vapors, a direct descendant of the medieval luster recipes. He understood, just as the Gothic masters did, that the beauty was in the material's own voice, in the streaks, bubbles, and variations that recorded its making. When you look at a Tiffany lamp, you are not looking at a product of the machine age. You are looking at a conscious revival of the medieval glassmaker's reverence for the unique, handmade object. That torch has been carried forward into countless studios around the world today. Walk into a modern stained glass workshop, and you will witness a direct, living continuation of the traditions we have traced. The tools may be electric kilns and propane torches instead of wood-fired grand fuse, but the fundamental principles are unchanged. An artist still begins by mixing a batch of silica, flux, and stabilizer, often sourcing materials from the same companies that supply industrial glassmakers, but selecting them for artistic effect. They still gather molten glass from a crucible, using a blowpipe or a solid rod. They still marver, shape and blow, or use the cylinder or crown methods to create their own sheets, each one unique. The coloring still relies on metallic oxides, cobalt for blue, copper for red and green, silver nitrate for stain. The real magic is that these modern artist glassmakers are not just replicators. They are innovators working within an ancient framework. They have the entire periodic table at their disposal, creating colors the medieval world could never dream of, like vivid oranges and pinks from selenium and gold. They combine techniques, fusing painted elements in kilns, laminating layers of glass, or incorporating modern materials like dichroic glass, which shifts color like a butterfly's wing. Yet, when they cut that glass with a diamond wheel instead of a hot iron, when they groze the edges with a carbide grinder instead of a notched iron, they are performing the same essential act as the medieval glazier, marrying form to material. When they solder their lead cames, or use copper foil techniques pioneered by Tiffany himself, they are solving the same structural puzzle: how to hold fragments of light together in a story that can withstand time and weather. The chain is unbroken. The contemporary artist standing before a glory hole, judging the perfect moment to gather, is having the same intuitive conversation with heat and viscosity as a master in a 13th century forest workshop. The legacy is not just in the preservation of old windows in cathedrals, but in the new windows being created for homes, hospitals, and museums every single day. Each one is a testament to a secret that was never truly lost, only passed from hand to hand, from fire to fire, proving that the most enduring light is the one that keeps being kindled anew. From that glowing gather on a blowpipe to the soaring windows of a cathedral, this was a journey of transformation, turning earth and fire into something that feels closer to captured sunlight. The true secret of medieval glassmaking was never a single formula locked in a vault. It was the powerful, inseparable fusion of three elements. First, the fiercely guarded technical knowledge, the alchemical recipes for color and clarity, passed from master to apprentice in the heat of the workshop. Second, the guild-protected skill, the decade-long training that turned raw strength into intuitive artistry, where judging the temperature of molten glass was a sense written in the body. And finally, the profound artistic vision, the understanding that this material was not just a surface, but a medium for light itself, capable of encoding theology, telling stories, and lifting the human spirit toward the divine. This trinity of craft, community, and meaning is what allowed sand and ash to become transcendent light. So the next time you find yourself near a historic church, a grand museum, or even a modern studio window, step inside. Pause for a moment, let your eyes adjust, look past the familiar picture and see the evidence of that ancient conversation. Find the bull's eye, trace the gentle curve of a hand-blown pane, watch how a ruby red glows from within. See the window not as a static painting, but as a living artifact of breath, fire, and faith. You are now looking with knowing eyes. If you enjoyed this journey into the light of history, consider subscribing for more explorations into the world's hidden mysteries, where every object has a story waiting to be told.